One. Welcome to the Association of Black Women Historians Election Table Talk Part 2. This is Season 2, Episode 3 of ABWH TV. I'm Elizabeth Todd Breland. I'm an Associate Professor of History at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and I'm the ABWH Midwest Regional Director. I am so excited to host what I know is going to be an excellent conversation. A big thank you to Callie Gross for the push to host this follow-up to our November initial election table talk and for her general vision for ABWH TV. I think as it was in the fall, as it continues, frankly, all the time, it's an important moment for Black women scholars and historians to weigh in on the historic moment we're living through. And I am joined by an amazing panel of brilliant historians to help us process this moment. So before we get into it, I'm going to briefly introduce them. We have Dr. Ashley Farmer, Assistant Professor at the University of Texas at Austin, Dr. Caretha Mitchell, Associate Professor at Ohio State University, Dr. Noliwe Rooks, W.E.B. Du Bois Professor at Cornell University, and Dr. Barbara Savage, the Geraldine R. Siegel Professor at the University of Pennsylvania. So I just want to start off today by doing just a brief check-in. How are you all feeling in these wild days and times?
I'll start if we're all just taking a deep breath. I hadn't realized until after noon and the taking of the oaths how much repressed rage and fury my body has been carrying for the last 5 years. And so there was that relief. I mean, it was like a physical lifting of that. So, and relief also because I have a niece whose husband is in the Air Force. And it has been, deployments are always difficult and challenging for families, but it's been rather frightful to have him serve under the past commander in chief. Mm-hmm. So the relief is real. Mm-hmm. And so I feel that.
Mm. Yeah.
I think I feel wary of what's to come. I mean, I'm certainly glad that Trump is gone, but I feel worried about this kind of narrative of a return to normalcy, because normalcy wasn't that great for us in the first place, and a swift kind of move towards reconciliation without, both holding Republicans accountable, but also thinking about the ways in which we failed everyday Americans on like housing, food, a living wage, and a COVID response.
Yeah.
I think I've been in the middle of completely relieved, but at the whole like the literal inauguration, I was like, are they coming? So the QAnon people who I didn't really know that much about. I mean, they've been around for a while, but I hadn't taken a deep dive into what they were on about. And so as I started figuring out, I was like, they think literally the military is about to rush the stage at any moment and start killing people. Like this is what they were talking about. And I was paying too much attention to it. So I had a deep sense of relief.
I will admit that relief is where I'm dwelling, because I very much have been doing this kind of constant prayer for Kamala Harris. In the same way that I did it for the Obamas. And so the inauguration was certainly a time when, all of the anxiety that I had around those kinds of things, of course, because I study violence, especially, I didn't need to pay attention to QAnon to have that fear. And so
I hear you. No, I think you all are certainly reflecting this range of emotions, the range of feelings coming out of this moment. And I appreciate that. We're going to get more into what a Biden and Harris administration may have. But first, I want to kind of go backwards to go forward. So I think one of the great things that you all have to add to this conversation is your historical knowledge. And I mean, if you just think back to the first 3 weeks of January, we've experienced the election of the first Black and Jewish senators of Georgia, an insurrection and attack on the Capitol, the second impeachment of Donald Trump, and the inauguration of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And I guess I just want to generally ask, how do you think history can help us to understand these events and the moments we find ourselves in today? And I'll just say for myself, pre-insurrection, I was prepping for class for my courses, and one of the courses I'm teaching, we start with Reconstruction. So I'm like deep in my Reconstruction bag while all of this is happening, and it was a surreal experience. And part of me felt like, wow, we went in one day from like Reconstruction to Redemption, 12 hours, boom, like. There's just a lot happening. So I'm wondering if you all can maybe share how history can help us to understand where we are.
It's a real challenge, I think, because the usual tropes of cycles of history don't really apply when all this stuff is happening so rapidly and in front of our very eyes or all at once. Because what we're seeing is actually, it's more of, in biblical terms, a battle between good and evil. And so it goes in this kind of a roller coaster, a set of cycles. It reminds me more, or most, I guess, of my childhood and witnessing the era of assassinations, with the Kennedy in 63 and 65, 68, and that kind of rapid change and uncertainty, again, being witnessed in real time. So I think so it's a real challenge for history and to think of historical precedents, although we see precedents for each of these happenings. And so I think we'll actually have to invent new models and new ways of dealing with the rapidity of this change and the witnessing of the ping ponging, back and forth.
Oh, if I could jump in there,
Please.
because I think this ping pong that you're referring to is exactly where I went in thinking about all of this, because it feels to me like one way to get my head around what we're seeing is what I call know your place aggression, right? This dynamic array of forces that answer the achievements of marginalized groups such that their success brings aggression as often as praise. And so it felt to me immediately, when January 6th happened, like, okay, the success of Stacey Abrams in Georgia, the success of Ossoff and Warnock in Georgia, in some ways we could see that insurrection as an immediate response and that kind of reaction to success of marginalized groups. But of course, I know the history well enough to know that the big responses are far from the only ones, right? So there's plenty of other smaller reactions to every iota of success that marginalized groups have had everywhere all the time. So part of what, this ping pong idea that you're offering, it feels to me like part of what we need is a way to understand what is it that is driving someone like a Stacey Abrams? Because what's so obvious to me is that, especially because she works in electoral politics and fighting against voter suppression, it feels like this is simply about civic inclusion. It would be easy to assume that she's about civic inclusion, but it feels to me like she knows that all of her successes will beckon violence. And so there's got to be something more dynamic. So in this spirit of ping pong, the idea that I really have been thinking through is homemade citizenship, right? This deep sense of success and belonging that doesn't rely on civic inclusion and mainstream recognition. And even though she looks like it's all about civic inclusion, it can't be, because she knows that her every success beckons aggression. So it feels to me like maybe that's a way of getting more dynamic.
And can I just come back right quick on that? And I think part of the violence that we're seeing, and then to me, everything that's gone on in the last, as I said, 4 or 5 years. I mean, when Obama was elected, I thought that we, as a people, as Black people, there would be hell to pay, that we would be punished for that for a very long time. I did not anticipate that the whole country would be punished in the way that it has been punished, and that the object of the punishment would be spread so widely. So I just want to say that's what I saw, at the Capitol. On Abrams, and I wanted to come to this later on, and maybe we'll come back to it, but we can't really talk about Stacey Abrams without talking about religion. And if we want to look for her motivation, her persistence, her endurance, she speaks about it in terms of her faith as a child of not one, but two United Methodist ministers. So at some point down the road, when we want to talk about some other things, I want to talk about religion and religious diversity in this moment among Black people, but also in the administration itself.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that history can help us understand is what is unprecedented and what is like a product of historical processes, right? Or the processes that enable them. So we haven't seen somebody rush the Capitol like we saw, but we certainly can use history to understand the processes of white supremacy, hypermasculinity, right? This xenophobia that swell together that makes somebody feel empowered to do that. But I love this conversation that we're having about alternative forms of citizenship, because I do think one of the things that the Trump administration has shown is the limits of something as static as the Constitution, and the limits as something as static as a checks and balances government. And it's asking people to stop kind of putting a blind faith in a democracy that just works, without people in it, and also ask us to think about what kind of citizenship we actually want. What do we want our government doing for us? And I think Black women, particularly at the grassroots level, offer us some of the best examples of how expansive and broad we can think about that.
Yeah, I think that what is in addition to citizenship, that I agree with Ashley Caretha, with all of you, that we are looking at a deep kind of engagement. I mean, for a while, I really was saying, those amendments that I'm constantly drawn to, those reconstructed, the 13th, 14th, 15th amendment, that literally for my family, and figuratively for anybody with Black skin in the US, are everything, right? But they're just amendments to the Constitution. And as we were watching a certain kind of erosion over time with this administration, that was starting with Muslims, that was starting with the hordes coming up from South America who are brown, I immediately started going to how many degrees of separation from that to anybody that skin and not birthright becomes the marker.
No, that's help. I mean, there's so many things that y'all are saying that I think are resonating deeply. One, I think the way in which Black people in this country have always questioned any type of stable sense of what citizenship is. I think there have been so many comparisons I've heard, whether people want to look back to other moments of political violence, North Carolina in the late 19th century, or other moments. I think one of the things I've been thinking about a lot, and it kind of speaks, I think, the leeway to something you were saying, is about a certain statism on the left and the right that is not a new phenomenon, and how that shows up in different ways, right? So on the one hand, you can think of, like the paramilitary politics that stormed the Capitol, right? Like that's an anti-statism. But I think there's also, to your sense, in a very different direction, the sort of rejuvenation under COVID of mutual aid, the ways in which various institutions within Black communities, but I would say on the broad left as well, have been working outside of the state. And I wonder what that means at this moment where there's so much focus on electoral politics for all the other forms of politics that are present, whether that's paramilitary politics, whether that's mutual aid, whether that's, the way that people are organizing. So I want to come back. I'm going to come back at the end of our conversation to get back to this organizing, but I do want to get a sense of sort of maybe some quick commentary from you all on what you're expecting or hoping or worried about in this new Biden Harris administration.
Well, I think we're all painfully aware of the limitations and of the challenges that they face. And I think we're all also really aware of the limitations of representational politics. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that goes without saying. Having said that, I will say it's nice to see it deployed in ways that we haven't seen in a long time, even if we recognize its limitations. And I would say also about Biden in particular, and I'm not defending him or trying to counter what's been said, but even I think we've sunk so low that the return of decency is actually a thing. that we're having to talk about now. And I think at a time when there's such a tremendous challenge and people who are suffering so much from loss and grief, that even that kind of minimal common denominator and this notion that the state, even if we think we might be living in sort of the eve of a failed state, because that's also an analysis that we could look at, but at least the idea that the state actually can do some good is, it's nice to see that again. But how low have we fallen that's the floor from which we now try to to build again.
That yes, decency is a low freaking bar, but we've seen how ordinary white people didn't meet that bar. And it feels to me like ordinary Joe is coming out to suggest that if you're going to call yourself decent and ordinary, you actually have to stand up against this villainy. And because he's a mediocre white man, he was able to withstand all of the challenges in the primary and get to this point. So I'm optimistic that that kind of if you consider yourself even a moderate, run-of-the-mill white person, if you're going to call yourself decent, you have to actually mobilize. And that, to my mind, is what he did in terms of making sure that we could get rid of Trump. And all of the high standards we had for everybody else made it such that he was the only one who could do it.
So I was having a conversation last night, and I was saying, Joe Biden right now and Joe Biden when in 2016 would have been two completely different Bidens. Joe Biden in the aftermath of Trump, in the aftermath of the so-called the norms that in the Senate that people talk about. Well, we all were basically the same, but we made it look like we were doing different things, and we all have the same donors. And what Trump decimated was not just poor people in this country and Muslim and immigrants and working people. Like, his policies didn't just gut that. They gutted any delusions you had about Democrats and Republicans being fundamentally similar, as Republicans treated Democrats, with the same levels of disdain, and made clear there were no depths to which they wouldn't sink. It made clear over and over, no, we mean it. We mean it. We will follow him to hell. We will tear this country apart. We are absolutely serious. And I think the mainstream of the Democratic Party, who would, at least in the history that I can summon from the past, talk one way and govern another. What is it? Run to the center, like you campaign left and then you govern right. I don't believe that's possible in the aftermath of what we've seen. We have sitting senators who are still trying to emotionally heal from the fact that their colleagues were calling for their death, are still trying to deal with the fact that they have colleagues who they thought, in the end, we're all in this experiment called America Together, who are still bringing guns onto the floor. Colleagues, before.
I actually think I'm sorry, I am speaking over you. Excuse me.
Go ahead, Barbara.
No, I'm sorry. I think that he, for the media, I'm not disagreeing with the notion of mediocre whiteness. I think he is actually more astute than we may give him credit for. And so if I have any kind of optimism, it really just sort of rests in the idea that at least there are people in power now who are competent and have some broader sense of commitment that may get us back to some place that was not great or that was not necessarily good. And I think that we'll see how that unfolds in the coming months. But I do think that there is a possibility of change here. I'm not saying that we're not still fighting neoliberalism. I'm not saying any of that, or that we're going back to something, some, great age. But I am just kind of watching with bated breath, I guess, and cautiously optimistic.
I think I'm trying to be inspired by y'all optimism, because I am not. And
That's fine.
I think that part of what I will say is I was having a conversation with my parents, and they also were talking about this decency. And I understand that. I understand that, but I think the competency part is where I appreciate a competent, there are basic competencies that will happen. I think the problem with competence is competence can be directed to many different ends, right?
Mhm.
And we are still, an imperialist nation. We are still a deeply divided nation. We are still a nation that is not providing for the basic things that our people in this country need. And so I think it's hard. I think that the sort of aggressive, vocal public white supremacy, if that becomes less acceptable because we're decent, the ideas behind it, the actions behind it don't go away. And I am not, I guess I also am trying to remember back to, we've talked a bit about representational politics. And I think and this may have been when I came through, but my disillusionment with the representational politics of the Obama period, right? I was in Grant Park in 2008 crying, right? And by the end of that administration, I was over it, right? And I think that the limits of representational politics is something I'm trying to remind myself about, even if it's like, okay, perhaps this is a decency. And I think also, and I will also say, I think this is a product of being in Chicago for so long now. I am still not convinced that there's that much difference between Democrats and Republicans. They're both largely corporate parties. And here we're a one-party system. We're a one-party system in the city and the state, and things are wild. And there is no decency on the ground for Black people, for working class Black people, for poor Black people, for any Black people, right? And so I think that is part of where I guess I'm having trouble with optimism. But I will say this: I had someone who told me, you don't have optimism presumes the outcome. Hope is something that you can go into every day with. So I'm going to hold on to hope, I think, in that respect. Go ahead, Barbara. You going to say something?
I just think that there's also a way in which, in which I think that we actually place way too much confidence in electoral politics in general. I mean, I know that's the system. I know voting is important, blah, blah, but I think the real work that we've seen bear fruit in the last year is not through electoral politics. It's through Black Lives Matter on the street. It's through the grassroots organizing and the door-to-door work that's being done, the local work that's being done. So I have always been pessimistic, actually, about the powers of the presidency, including when Obama inherited it, especially because he was not a particularly seasoned politician and had never run anything in his life either. So I share a profound lack of faith in politics. And electoral politics is the place where we should be placing our hope or our optimism. I'm just saying that under the circumstances that we've gone through, here we are.
Yeah, no, I just want to say really, really fast. The things that if I'm not optimistic, I can be happy. I can be happy about the fact that deportations are immediately stopped. And Cori Bush is fierce.
Yes,
Yes.
I would say that's the only thing I'm optimistic about. I'm with you. I'm kind of on we're in white supremacist and imperialism light in the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party. But I do think that is the thing to be most optimistic about. One of my students asked me not too long ago if I thought what happened in Georgia could happen in Texas. And you'll remember, at the midterms, I actually went to bed thinking, Beto might, cruise, right? And I was like, yeah, it can. We've got to, do the grassroots work, but it can. And I think it is showing a new generation of folks what it is to kind of dig deep, sit down and do the work and play the long game, and that there's a reward for playing the long game. And for some of the folks, especially my students, that's the first time they've really seen, that kind of thing come to fruition. And I think they have found it quite inspiring. So from that standpoint, I'm very optimistic about people realizing the power of grassroots politics, even if I'm less so about the executive office.
And that's where the action is.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where that's where the power is to change. And I'm not invested in the Democratic Party, but that it's that level of local, specific, sustained,
Mm-hmm.
enduring work that perks up rather than the other way. And that's the only way that you get people in office, who will speak to the kinds of issues that we care most about.
And on that point, I think as historians, we know that too, right? Like change isn't coming from the top. We see it happen. We see it coming
The
from
bad
the
change comes from
the bad change. That's a good call. The bad
from
change
the
comes
front,
from
comes
the
from
top.
the top.
So, okay, we're running low on time, but I want to just go around to everyone quickly. And I think you've already started to do this, so it'll push us forward. But what are some bright spots for you? What are some things that you're looking forward to beyond what we said, or any just sort of comment? I mean, I'll give like a light bright spot. Look, I was very inspired by the outerwear at the inauguration. That felt like a light, bright spot to me. But there are lots of other things I think more substantive to be hopeful about. So if there's any other sort of things that you sort of quick fire bright spots.
I can quick fire and say that, one of the things that Brittany Cooper said in Eloquent Rage that always sticks with me is that recognition is a human need, and there is something violent about a world that denies Black women recognition on a regular basis. And so for me, as much as I recognize the limits of representation, remembering the power of it too, it feels like a bright spot to me, so that I can hold on to the good feeling and not discount it for myself. I'll give myself that bright spot and share it with other people.
Mm-hmm.
I think I can be happy about the fact that there are elements in the Democratic Party that I can support with my whole chest for the first time in a very long time. There are individual people that this is not about who's in the executive office. And we never really even talked about Kamala, but this is not about the executive office, but that there are elements that are straight about freedom and poor people and are saying it with their whole chest. And that's the first that I've experienced that at all. So I can be hopeful about that.
I mean, I started out, I guess, saying I was optimistic, and I think there might be generational differences in our measures of optimism. But having sort of gone through all of this, so many cycles in my life, I do still have some optimism about this moment and the possibilities that the enormous powers of the federal state can be deployed in some ways, large and small, that will benefit some ordinary people in ways that we certainly haven't seen in the last 4 or 5 years. And that's, and I think even beginning with the recognition of the death and loss at the reflecting pool, which, brought a certain kind of importance there, that also I think was well done. I thought it was inspiring, and inspiration is part of what I think we need in this moment. It is not enough. It is not everything. But I do think that for many people, it felt like a breath of fresh air.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, to piggyback on my comments about, and renewed interest in kind of grassroots organizing, I'm optimistic about people's interest in history. I can't tell you how many people I know who have not historians, doctors, lawyers, plant workers, et cetera, who have now decided to go and read a book about Reconstruction, right? Or the number of, enrollees in our classes about Black history or Black women's history that have shot up in the process of Kamala and Trump and et cetera. So I think we are in a moment when people are searching for, how did we get here? How do I better understand this? Why was what I thought was going in the world so fundamentally different than what I expected to happen on January 6th? Or, what constitutes a peaceful transfer of power? What do you mean this is an anomaly in most parts of the world?
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're asking different questions, and they're seeking history to provide some of those answers. So I'm hopeful that we as historians have a moment to kind of offer people some different responses to that, and also interest in poetry after
Yes.
the inauguration too, right? One
Yes.
time for the humanities,
Yes.
in the new administration.
Thank you, Ashley, for that. And that's actually fantastic. I mean, I guess I kind of want to close us out and say that I think whether folks see this as a moment of harm reduction or a moment for real transformational possibilities in the future, this emphasis on grassroots organizing, the way in which we see that happening, have seen that happening, continue to see it happening, is something that's certainly inspiring. And I do want to end on that Black girl magic of Amanda Gorman, because, you
Yes.
know, she was phenomenal. And, you know, I think her closing line of that poem was everything. So I'm going to end us on that, where Amanda Gorman said, "For there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it." And I hope all of us find some space to be brave enough to be it. So I will close us there. Thank you all so much. You're
Thank you
amazing.
all.
Thank you, ABWH.
Bye.